Today's facilitators are Chuck Setchell and Mohamed Hilmi. Chuck Setchell has nearly 40 years of experience in managing the process of physical, social, and economic change, both in the U.S. and abroad. He has helped respond to all major international disasters and crises since his arrival at OFDA in 1998, designing and implementing shelter and settlement projects and risk reduction activities in numerous countries. He makes presentations at training courses, meetings, and conferences on a regular basis, and has published on a wide variety of topics. Mohamed Hilmi is a humanitarian shelter and reconstruction specialist. Currently, Hilmi is managing the Humanitarian Shelter and Settlement Working Group at Interaction to collectively improve the collaboration, capacity, and practice of stakeholders who respond to humanitarian disasters and crises. Previously, he's worked for UN agencies and INGOs in complex humanitarian emergencies and development programs. He has responded to emergencies around the world. And with this, I will pass over to Chuck and Hilmi, and we look forward to your presentation today.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to disasterready.org for organizing the webinar to really help us promote our new online shelter and settlements training course. Thanks to my colleague, Mohamed Hilmi, and my colleagues Eddie Argagnol, Lee Mullaney, and others at OFDA for helping develop the online course. A bit of background is in order. I first developed a shelter and settlements training course for OFDA in 2009. And from that time to the completion of the online version earlier this year, the world's population in a mere 5 years has increased by over 430 million people. Urban growth in the developing regions of the world accounted for 98% of that total, almost 100%, indicating a very remarkable increase in and concentration of our species, Homo sapiens, living in the cities of developing regions. These rapidly growing settlements are at the center of the opportunities and challenges of providing humanitarian shelter to disaster and crisis-affected populations, both now and in the future. In the next few minutes, I'll focus on 2 of 4 topics that Anna would like us to cover. The impact of shelter in the overall recovery of communities, or as we say, settlements, and livelihoods and markets, and the importance of understanding local context and the self-recovery of affected populations. With that, let's begin. So, as you see, we have on our cover slide a picture of what we believe are the first 2-story humanitarian shelters provided by the humanitarian community. This was in Haiti in 2011, and really reflective of the context that we're going to be talking about, the urban context in particular. And if you don't think shelter is important, think about the recent Great Recession that we were in here in the United States. It's lasted 10 years or so. The cornerstone of that recession was really the failure of housing and real estate markets more generally. Had a profound impact on our overall economic activity, and we saw this in the 1980s in Japan with the Great Recession that they had, and in the 90s in Southeast Asia with the Great Recession that they had. Both of those recessions, as well as ours, were linked to housing, to shelter in particular. The economic impacts of shelter are really quite profound. They're much greater than anyone would anticipate. Even modest increments of shelter assistance in the form of tents or plastic sheeting can really have very broad economic impacts in disaster and crisis-affected communities. Can really jumpstart affected settlements to get them on the road to recovery. Can really lead the transition to longer-term reconstruction. This is particularly the case when an emphasis is placed on local labor and local materials. We don't get the proverbial bang for your buck if we fly in prefabricated structures, for example, or trailers or module kind of structures, but rather rely upon, to the extent possible, and if it's available, local materials and local labor. We find that not only are these economic impacts quite profound, but also the acceptance of the local populations is also greatly enhanced when they have familiar materials and they're engaged in the process. In shelter, one of the great economic activities that we see, not only just in the provision and construction of shelter, but in the use of structure. It's not just for survival or living, it's also a production platform. We see time and again that our shelter and the shelter of others provided in the wake of crises and disasters are used for home-based enterprises of various kinds. The pictures show vendors in two of the slides, and one a woman making some yarn for sale in the local market. This is something that we see in almost every country that we work in. It's much more profound and pronounced than it is here in the United States, where housing and also in other more developed economies, housing tends to be only for living. That, of course, is changing as we see a lot of home-based enterprises in the housing of developed countries as well. So shelter is more than just plastic sheeting or tents and houses. It can also be a business or factory, a barn, a warehouse, a granary, and really a key feature of all settlements. 60% or so of structures in a given settlement are often houses, but they have a multiple activities associated with them. So when you read in the paper that 10,000 or so houses were destroyed in a flood, that might be a lot of jobs and a lot of factory assets, a lot of grain that was stored, a lot of animals that were being provided shelter amidst the larger home. So it has very significant economic links and very profound implications if overlooked as part of response. So, a little math. S greater than 4W plus R. Shelter is far more than just four walls and a roof. And really the utility of shelter assistance to response and recovery, again, even modest forms of shelter and transitional shelter, or TS, more so, can really jumpstart and re-engage affected populations in the incremental, longer-term process of housing development that exists in almost every country that we work in. It really is a means of promoting livelihoods and disaster risk reduction, or DRR. And unlike other sectors of humanitarian assistance, there's no easy handoff to our colleagues in the development community. With a programmatic vacuum, it's all the more reason to emphasize transition and context. And shelter, the humanitarian counterpart to housing, doesn't exist in a vacuum, but in settlements. And these are the places where people live, from transit centers to megacities. And settlements provide context. It's shelter and its setting, or settlements, and context. This really provides us with an understanding, a petri dish, if you will, to understand shelter and the dynamics of shelter and other activities. And trends affecting settlements are many, and one stands out. The future is urban. I alluded to it earlier. Global populations are increasing dramatically, and we're in the midst of a very large population bubble. And the equivalent of 92% of that total growth over the 2010-2030 period is going to be located in the cities of developing countries, really dramatically increasing their population. And I did say 92%. That's 1.4 billion more urban residents in developing countries, or the equivalent of the city the size of Curitiba or Cape Town or Dar es Salaam or Surabaya every 2 weeks of every month of every year for 20 years. And by now, most of you, if not all of you, have seen that movie, a very highly acclaimed film, Slumdog Millionaire. The conditions depicted in the film are experienced by nearly 1 of 6 human beings on the planet at this time, and by 2030, nearly 1 of every 4. So not only are we seeing a very large change in the pattern of settlement growth, but we're also seeing a very large concentration of poverty in cities. And there's a reason why I and others emphasize context, and context, context, context. It sounds like location, location, location. We really need to view settlements, especially urban settlements, as land and housing markets. And they've been disrupted by disasters or crises. Shelter provision generates greater economic impacts than any other humanitarian assistance sector. We really need to view shelter and settlements activities as recovery and economic development tools. One of the key things that we emphasize at OFDA is the idea of shelter opportunity surveys, or SOS. We can identify shelter opportunities throughout the built environment and not just housing. It could be an old warehouse or an old office building or something like that, other than just housing. So context is important, and part of that entails processes and profiles. You see in the pictures homes in various countries, in very divergent countries, but they all have a common element, and that is building materials on the side of the house that are going to be used at some subsequent point to improve and expand the home. And profiles, or damage profiles, provides us with insights on the impacts and needs and opportunities and resources in a given settlement. These pictograms that you see in the slide really are from damage assessment forms, reconnaissance forms used in past disasters to provide you with an understanding of how to categorize the gradation of damage. And if you recall the Haiti earthquake of 2010, the immediate impression was that 100% of structures were destroyed, when in fact through a damage profile we discovered that about 55% or so of all of those housing structures were fine. They would be considered to be undamaged or lightly damaged. A very different understanding, and gives you new insights in how you might be able to provide shelter in the wake of disaster. And really taking a cue from context is really a key priority and concern of ours. Re-engaging existing processes that were present prior to the disaster event really facilitates this recovery and permanence, so that we can build upon those processes, and often those are done through the process of self-recovery, where people kind of brush themselves off after a disaster and start rebuilding on their own or with the assistance of friends and family, typically not with the assistance of international community actors or national governments. We seek to support that to re-engage more rapidly that existing process of self-recovery so that we can facilitate permanence. So really what we do in the international community is play catch-up. Again, taking a cue from context, recovery begins before we in the international community arrive. We really need to play catch-up. And again, a cue from context. Hosting begins before we arrive. Hosting is a process by which people seek out shelter largely from family and friends, but not exclusively so. So people in other countries feel an obligation to provide assistance to friends, family, village mates, schoolmates, etc., and to host them as part of a response. It's really kind of a self-recovery effort. We seek to support that as well, and we need to play catch-up as well. An example, Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 10 years, now 14 years, 13 years rather, after a large volcanic eruption in the city in 2002. We provided through a couple of international NGOs some very modest shelter, which you see in the center of the slide with plastic sheeting. Over time, all of those 5,000 shelters that we provided had been upgraded by the beneficiaries of our assistance into permanent housing. And some of that only took 1 or 2 years. Others took longer owing to their circumstances. But all of the shelter that we provided in 2002 has been upgraded to a more durable and permanent home. So, with that in mind, the settlements approach. It's shelter-led, yes, but multi-sectoral, reflecting the multifaceted character of context, i.e. settlements. It's opportunistic with regard to livelihood promotion and disaster risk reduction or mitigation. It's cognizant of gender and environment, and local organizations, and social relations. It's transitional by linking relief and developmental concerns, and it's really accountable to local governing structures and populations. And some positive developments in this regard include some key humanitarian assistance organizations, such as the International Federation of the Red Cross and Crescent, are now embracing this shelter and settlements approach. Those engaged in humanitarian shelter are now seeing this as a very valuable approach to understanding response and recovery and reconstruction. The shelter cluster itself, the formal humanitarian community entity focused on shelter, is now supporting shelter and settlements activities and linking with other clusters and engaging with development actors, both local, national, and international actors. And the camp coordination and management agencies, UNHCR and IOM, have adopted out-of-camp policies and programs in the recent past in response primarily to urban displacement. But I think it's a very, very positive development that the major key organizations in humanitarian assistance are now seeing the value and importance of the shelter and settlements approach to really provide support to recovery processes that are largely beneficiary driven. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Hilmi.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Anna and Disaster Ready for hosting us. I will just, I have only 3 or 4 slides, which I will go through the challenges the humanitarian community face in terms of meeting some of the expectations. Let me start by saying that the scale of recent disasters like Haiyan, Nepal, and other places, and going back a few years earlier, like Chuck mentioned about Haiti, Pakistan floods. If you go further into about 10 years ago, Asian tsunami, Kashmir earthquakes, the amount of people getting displaced because of their houses damaged is huge. For example, the Pakistan, 18 million people were affected. Their houses were damaged or destroyed. In Haiti, the numbers are large, and we are still counting the numbers in some cases in Nepal. So the amount of people that the humanitarian community had to assist is huge. This doesn't, the disaster that I mentioned doesn't include the regular day-to-day disasters like small floods and others, which make up about 80% of the disasters happen in the world. So you don't read about those in newspapers or CNN or BBC. But many agencies work in those disasters as well. But in terms of the key challenges, the scale is one. More and more disasters happening in urban areas is another major challenge. Traditionally, the humanitarian community used to work in rural areas where we had the freedom to design our program. The communities are more cohesive, more or less, and then the governance structure is much weaker in many cases, so you can work with a lot of people to design your response. But when it comes to more and more urban areas, it gets more complex because there are rules and regulations that you, codes, other things you need to follow. There are policies put in place by certain local authorities like no-build zones, and land issues affect some other responses like in Port-au-Prince. So these are challenges. In addition to that, we also have issues like identifying the affected population. Because of the diversity in an urban area, this complicates your assessment. So traditionally, as Chuck mentioned, we used to go household by household and ask about their needs and desires and how they want to build and what are the needs, how many kids are there, where they go to school, what kind of health services they needed. But in an urban area, this becomes more complex because the communities live in a neighborhood or in a settlement where services are provided by different stakeholders and different entities. So this is one of the key challenges. The other one, going further, the amount of funding in recent humanitarian disasters doesn't meet the needs or estimation to rebuild or assist rebuild permanent homes. For example, for the humanitarian system in humanitarian request in Philippines, Haiyan, the need was met. I think it's about 40% against the request. And in terms of permanent housing, we very rarely see, it taking place in terms of funding or in terms of implementation, in terms of policies. Not much happens going back to Haiti and any other recent disaster. In Philippines, there are still about 200,000 people living in bunk houses. So this is a problem that we need to address, and we will look at it how we can address this later on. And in terms of building permanent housing, the humanitarian community or the agencies doesn't have the capacity to build such large-scale permanent housing. The technical expertise, the knowledge, the resources that are needed to build large-scale housing, it's much more different than our regular humanitarian response. And the other thing that affect, for example, I mentioned some other things like no-build zone in Philippines. I think in Sri Lanka, after the tsunami, we had policies put in place not along the coastal line. These things, and some of the governments also go very quickly to displace or relocate people from some of the vulnerable areas into other things. Even though they have lived there for generations, it is a default response for many of the governments to take people out from one area and then let's say, okay, we are going to provide you housing and we are going to build you anything and move here. But what actually happens is they will get a transitional or temporary housing in places, or camps, bunk houses, other forms of housing, but these people are without livelihood, access to services, healthcare, education, and other services which are missing in the new places, especially the livelihood. So these are some of the concerns that we face, and then I will move into the next slide. Okay. So what we can do to address some of these concerns and how the humanitarian impact or the work done by humanitarian community can help some of these challenges we are facing, how we can overcome this is my next slide. One of the things that we see over and over again, the amount of people who self-recover, that means who get very, very little assistance from the humanitarian community, either they get money from remittance from their relatives overseas, or other forms from their savings, other forms, it's huge. So they, as Chuck mentioned, they don't wait many times that for humanitarian assistance to come. They will start their recovery very, very early. But one of the challenge in that is most of those self-recovery often take place so quickly and without some of the very key aspects of safety. Some of the houses, if you go through some of the reports, you would see that when they self-recover, reconstruct their house from some of the materials that's been already used from their previous housing, the structure and other safety issues are missing, that the house often becomes more vulnerable than the previous house they used to live. So some of the things that the humanitarian community can do is to assist with this knowledge transfer or inform them on provide technical assistance to help these self-recovery make it better. The other thing that happens in post-disaster is the diverse amount of stakeholders who engage in some sort of recovery. There are private sector, there are governments, the local institutions, all try and help these affected people in one way or the other. And we really, in most places, the humanitarian community is kind of disconnected from some of these efforts that is going on locally. So I think we can leverage by connecting with these national actors who are working for the same recovery, and inform them and engage with them, and informed by their decision and our decision together how we can leverage the humanitarian assistance go further. The other issue that is happening is that oftentimes the recovery and reconstruction policy and assistance is lacking in many places. Often it becomes very late. Often it starts in a kind of a vacuum, ignoring the work that has already been done by the humanitarian and other local stakeholders, and it often starts kind of as a new development project. Oftentimes you would see this doesn't go so far to meet everybody's housing needs. In fact, very few examples of permanent housing construction going effectively taken place. There's only very few examples. So that is something that we humanitarian community would like to work and make sure that the work we have done is taken advantage of, and how also we can contribute to those development efforts in terms of housing. Is very important. The third part of that also is the DRR aspects of it. We build a lot of assets, a lot of communities, but as long as you don't address some of the risks that they are facing in their community, in their settlements, if it is not taken care of, this will repeat. So some of the things I can discuss a little bit later, maybe during the question and answers. So most of these things I think Chuck mentioned, and I also just touched base on. So I would stop there, and I will pass it on to Anna, and then we will take some of the questions, and then we can discuss some of these points over there.
Great, thank you so much, Chuck and Hilmi. That was quite an engaging presentation. We do have some questions that have been submitted to the chat box, and we encourage all participants to submit any questions you have into the chat window, and we will add them to our queue and address them as we are able. Let's see, we'll move forward. I think we had an image to share. We do have the information for the Shelter and Settlements Working Group here. We can also add that into our chat window. And for our questions, Chuck, did you want to speak quickly to this image?
Sure. You recall at the beginning of the slideshow, there were some two-story transitional shelters that really featured some of our plastic sheeting. These are the same shelters a year and a half later. They've been upgraded to permanence. They are examples, again, of kind of accelerated recovery to a more durable kind of shelter solution. These shelters are, again, two-story. They're essentially duplexes. People live, different families live upstairs and downstairs. Very large families occupy one of the entire structure. They've weathered a couple of hurricanes and some floods, and they're all intact and doing quite well, thank you. And so, again, a very good example of how to upgrade to permanence. Anna?
Thank you, Chuck. It's always nice to see the story through, and it's nice to hear that into that story. We'll begin with some questions that we have, and again, we'd like to remind all participants to submit questions you do have to the chat window. But the first question, roughly about how many houses are damaged or destroyed in a year, and how many of those houses are rebuilt by the humanitarian community?
This is a very difficult question. The reason there is no hard number for this, most of the house damage assessment are done in very large-scale disasters like Haiti, Haiyan, Nepal, and other places. So if you're talking about these major UN declared disasters, then there are numbers that we are missing the slide. Sorry. Okay, we can give some numbers, but since about, as I mentioned, 80% of the disasters happen in very small scale, in very, very small scale disasters, and the numbers there are not tallied in by many agencies. So I did some work trying to figure out how many houses are damaged globally, and there's no accurate numbers. But for example, if you take the Asian tsunami, there's about 500 to 600,000 houses were damaged only in that by that earthquake and tsunami. And in Pakistan, later on in the earthquake, 600,000 just on that disaster, 600,000 houses were damaged. In Haiti, the numbers are around 250,000, closer to that, and in so these are the large numbers that we do. And for example, in Pakistan, there was about 18 million people lost their houses, and then the humanitarian community supported about 12 million people. So the exact number of houses that you assess, it varies because it is not houses that are built. For example, our response varies from assisting people with cash, assisting people with rental support because they used to be renters, assisting people with hosting support, material support to repair their houses. So the assistance varies. So in terms of actual number of houses that is being built, new structures, maybe one number, but in terms of the housing solution provided would be much larger. Does it kind of give you did it answer the question? I can go further and I'll give you one more statistic. In 2013 itself, just 2013, 22 million people were displaced because of their damage to housing by natural disasters. This doesn't count people who are displaced by the war and conflict. So these 22 million people were displaced in 2013 according to World Disaster Report published by IFRC. And some of these displaced people may go back in a few days, because they repair, they stay with their, stay until the flooding is cleared. But there's large, significant number of them will be displaced for longer term.
Thank you, Hilmi. That and relating to the answer to that wonderful answer that you just gave, building on a specific example, in the context of the Nepal earthquake, where hundreds of small villages, each having dozens of houses, were destroyed or badly damaged, what is the best place to build transitional shelters? And would you build a new settlement in a different location, preferably, or remove the rubble and build them at their original place? So to repeat the question, in an example of the Nepal earthquake, what's the best place to build transitional housing? Is it best to build a new settlement in a different location or remove rubble and build in the original location?
Thanks, Anna. I think it's very interesting and obviously a very challenging question. In real time, these conversations and questions are being raised in the wake of the April earthquake. My sense is that looking at settlements and looking at the impacts, as we talked about, of settlements can give you clues as to what might be, quote unquote, the best place to build. In many places and in many instances, people will prefer to stay where they are. They've been on that land for a long time, perhaps through their families for decades, if not multiple generations. They have a very strong tie to the land. They may, in the case of the Pakistan earthquake years ago in 2005, people could not leave, didn't want to leave their land because they would lose their rights of occupancy to that land. They would essentially become kind of landless squatters. So a real problem there. Most people want to return and stay on their land. That makes it all the more imperative, I think, to make sure that any assistance provided is assistance that is informed by seismic risk reduction measures at both the shelter and the settlement level. We have had instances in the past, Afghanistan is an example in the region of Nepal, where we have suggested to settlements that maybe they need to move to a safer location. And in cases where land is held communally, many settlement members decided to move the settlement. In the wake of the 2002 earthquake in Afghanistan, we provided assistance to approximately 80 villages, and 3 of those villages decided after a lot of consultation that they would move a short distance away from the original site of their settlement to a much, much safer location. Portions of about 20 other villages were also relocated to safer locations. But each settlement, as you might imagine, with my emphasis on context, each settlement is unique, and each one needs to be assessed appropriately and with full engagement of the members of that settlement, the residents of that settlement. So the best place to build shelter is usually the place that's defined by a combination of factors. Obviously, land tenure is one, tied to the land, the economic networks, the social networks that exist, and the possibility of reducing risk. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Chuck. And thank you for the reminder that this is certainly not a simple answer to any of the questions and how important context is. This is a bit of a more practical question. What is your opinion of prefabricated shelters, such as the IKEA flat pack design?
This is a question that comes up often, and we have been looking at this very closely for a very long time. We are of the opinion at USAID OFDA that looking at first local materials availability and local labor availability and salvaging of materials that might be readily available in the wake of, certainly in the Nepal earthquake, there's a lot of salvage material being reused. Where that's possible and where that's feasible, we promote that. Where we feel a need to bring in materials to supplement that, it could be plastic sheeting, it could be timber, it could be other materials, we can do that. One of the virtues of salvaging materials, reusing materials, or looking at materials from nearby locations and in local markets is that, for example, the logistics and transportation costs are quite low. relative to the importation, typically the importation of prefabricated structures. There's a time delay associated with prefabricated shelter in transport, clearing customs, moving to sites. Often the cost of prefabricated shelters is high relative to local solutions. All of that transport and logistics costs can easily double the cost of prefabricated shelters. And oftentimes prefabricated shelters require specialized labor that may not be available in local markets in order to assemble it and service it. Maintaining prefabricated shelters after provision is often difficult as well. Some of the shelters don't have carts that are available locally, could increase the cost and reduce the operational capacity of prefabricated shelters. Finally, given those concerns, it's often difficult to provide prefabricated shelters at scale to a lot of people. So that is often a challenge because we don't want to see in the international community some discrepancies or inequalities associated with the output of assistance. And often very relatively high-cost prefabricated shelters provided in limited numbers may create that kind of tension and conflict that we really would rather not see. Hilmi?
Yeah, and also in addition to that, adaptability and the transition of these prefabricated shelters into permanent homes is often very difficult. We haven't seen really a study on how IKEA Flatpack really performed. At least I haven't seen that. And then a longitudinal study of how these are adapted is another thing that we need to look. Often when we import prefabricated structures, it's very hard to make it permanent using local materials. So this is one of the concerns also that need to be looked into.
Thanks to both of you for those answers. It's related and related to that question a bit, and expanding regarding technology and what is the role of new technologies and how does it affect your work? And could you give us some examples of new technologies in use?
Yes, there's some good adaptation in recent years of how many humanitarian and other agencies have used technology. For example, on using mapping to do assessment at the initial, gathering initial data and then more detailed assessment. We have used technologies such as cash transfer using ATM card, in places like Pakistan, where a large number of people were given ATM cards, not without challenges, but much more easier than carrying, whatever amount of cash and going to every single village and hand over these. So it makes sometimes it's faster, and sometimes also challenges like people don't know how to use ATM machines, and so some of these things when technology you use, you also need to ensure to resolve those small problems. And some other things like open street mapping, what else? Very quick analysis of community feedback, for example, using mobile phones. In many places, agencies have provided a free number for communities to call back and do complaints or let them know how the assistance is going, so that the agencies and responders know what is happening in the community much more quicker. So these are really good practices, same as Facebook and Twitter and other places to kind of know general sense of what the community is, what is happening in the community. Chuck, you want to add anything?
No, I would just say that we're seeing now the rise of drones. We're seeing now open street mapping. We're seeing multiple technologies that are geo-referenced. They will help inform the kinds of activities that we seek to promote in settlements. It will make it easier to depict and illustrate and to assess and to understand those conditions in need of response. So I think they're very powerful, potentially very, very powerful tools that can really help expedite and improve assistance. So we're quite optimistic, taking it slowly, looking very closely at these various activities to make sure that they work for us and beneficiaries.
And our last question, we have about 4 minutes left, so we'll do our last question and then wrap it up. You mentioned the importance of using local materials and local labor when possible. Going back to Nepal and the volume of homes damaged or destroyed, to rebuild houses or shelters, skilled manpower like masons and carpenters is not enough. How can this vacuum be filled or this situation be improved?
I think certainly what we're seeing, not only as a part of our response activities, but the international community as well as the national government, we are looking at very large-scale provision of training and hands-on training, not just academic classroom training, but hands-on training to masons and carpenters to make sure that they understand and can convey on their own to others the need to build back safely through seismic-resistant construction measures. We're scaling up programs that we at OFDA have had in Nepal for about 20 years, using local NGOs. All of the structures that we had retrofitted, for example, schools in Nepal stood up to the earthquake, so there's strong evidence that these types of activities and measures work. I think the combination of not just training by all of those involved in Nepal and supporting that training, but also amplifying that training through a lot of the new technologies that we were just talking about, the social messaging, texting, everything from radio programming to online Facebook training to village-level activities. We're trying to amplify that message that building back safer is very important and that we can provide some assistance in doing so. Hilmi, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that's and also to highlight very, very briefly this. Unlike in the developing world, not every house is built by a team of masons and carpenters. Oftentimes, it is started by some skilled people, and community, the families add addition to their homes and things like that. So, it's also important to inform the community about the safety of the house as part of this awareness program. What makes a house safe and how do you maintain some of the houses they received and things like that. That also should be part of the training and capacity building. Yeah.
Okay, Anna.
Thank you so much, Chuck and Hilmi, for being here today and for your thoughtful presentation. On the screen, we have some additional resources, and we will also put those links into the chat window. We wanted to remind participants today that in addition to the recording of this webinar and slides that will be posted on disasterready.org, We also have the Shelter and Settlements training course on disasterready.org. Chuck mentioned that early on in the presentation. The course introduces the basics of humanitarian community shelter and settlements activities, including some history and trends related to the sector, best practices and assessments and programming strategy, basic shelter responses, the relationship between shelter and its context, which are settlements, and how to promote the recovery of affected settlements. So we encourage you to have a look at all of the resources on the screen and reach out to us with any questions or feedback that you have. For the questions that we were not unable to answer during the session due to time, we will follow up with those participants who asked the questions and get back to you with answers for those. Finally, we would like to remind everyone of some upcoming webinars on disasterready.org. We have an online coaching series. It'll be 2 sessions in August with Joel Nielsen from UNHCR. It's related to our Essential Skills for New Managers pack. We also have innovative simulation exercises with a representative from the World Bank and one from our own disasterready.org. We encourage you to have a look at those online and register as you're able. Thank you to everyone for attending today. A real special thank you to Chuck and Hilmi. We so appreciate your presentation and your thoughtful insights today. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you all again soon on another Disaster Ready webinar.